They invited me into the conference room with corporate smiles and a restructuring announcement. Nobody noticed the small USB drive tucked in my jacket pocket. Just one line of code within it was enough to strangle an empire that confidently believed they had eliminated their outdated burden. Only when the atmosphere in the management room began to spiral into chaos from returned reports did they finally understand. I wasn't the redundant one. I was their license to exist. My name is Clara Whitmore, and for 19 years, I've been the invisible foundation upon which Orion Core Technologies built its empire. At 38, I've watched this biotech giant grow from a scrappy startup in a Brooklyn warehouse to a Manhattan powerhouse preparing for its IPO. While others chased headlines and quarterly reports, I quietly maintained the licenses, certifications, and regulatory compliance that kept our doors open and our products flowing across international borders. Most people don't understand what I do. They see me as the woman with the thick binders, the one who asks uncomfortable questions about export classifications and FDA protocols during product launches. They roll their eyes when I mention Section 809 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or when I insist on reviewing every single line of our manufacturing certifications. But what they don't realize is that every single license Orion Core holds, from our core operating permit to our specialized biocontainment clearances, bears my name as the Officer of Record. The warning signs began 3 months ago when Orion Core hired Adam Lockridge as our new Chief Operating Officer. Adam came from a Big Four consulting firm, armed with PowerPoint presentations about operational efficiency and resource optimization. His first week, he scheduled individual meetings with every department head to discuss streamlining opportunities. When my turn came, he spent exactly 12 minutes reviewing my role before declaring that my position could be significantly modernized. "Clara," he said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, "I appreciate your dedication, but we need to think about the future. These compliance processes you manage, surely they can be automated, outsourced? We're bleeding money on regulatory overhead." I had seen this before. New executives who confused process with paperwork, who believed that artificial intelligence could replace institutional knowledge. I explained patiently that our licenses weren't just documents. They were living agreements with federal agencies, each one requiring specific expertise, ongoing maintenance, and personal accountability. The FDA doesn't negotiate with algorithms. The Department of Commerce doesn't accept automated signatures on export licenses. Adam nodded absently, already checking his phone. "We'll circle back on this," he said, which I understood to mean he had already made his decision. That evening, I went home to my small apartment in Queens and did what I had learned to do after nearly 2 decades in corporate America. I prepared. I pulled out every contract, every licensing agreement, every regulatory document I had signed over the years. Most employees don't read the fine print of their employment contracts, but I had written much of mine. Buried in Section 12B of my original agreement was a clause I had negotiated during my 5th year at Orion Core. In the event of involuntary termination, the Officer of Record retains the right to voluntarily revoke any licenses held in their name without company consent, subject to a 72-hour notification period. I had included this clause after watching a colleague at another company get fired and then watch helplessly as her former employer used her credentials fraudulently for months. The lawyers had barely glanced at it during contract review, dismissing it as standard professional protection language, but I knew better. In a company where I held over 47 different licenses and certifications, that clause wasn't just protection, it was a nuclear option. Over the following weeks, Adam's modernization campaign gained momentum. He hired external consultants to audit every department, looking for redundancies. He instituted mandatory efficiency training sessions where he preached about agile methodologies and lean operations. Most telling, he hired Kelsey Morton, a 28-year-old with an MBA and no practical experience in regulatory compliance, as a license management associate. "Kelsey will be working closely with you to document your processes," Adam announced during a staff meeting. "We want to ensure knowledge transfer and create scalable systems." I watched Kelsey take notes on her tablet, nodding enthusiastically as Adam outlined her role. She had the eager confidence of someone who believed that complex regulatory frameworks could be reduced to flowcharts and checklists. When she approached me after the meeting, full of questions about optimizing our compliance workflows, I recognized the pattern. She wasn't being hired to work with me. She was being hired to replace me. The dismantling began subtly. First, my access to the company's primary email system was temporarily restricted while IT implemented security upgrades. Then, my login credentials for the regulatory dashboard were suspended pending system integration testing. Finally, my digital signature authority was revoked for audit compliance. Each change was presented as routine maintenance, but the message was clear. I was being systematically disconnected from the systems I had built and maintained. The younger employees began treating me differently. I overheard whispered conversations about outdated methods and digital transformation. During lunch, I heard someone joke, "Who needs Clara's paper filing system when we have cloud-based AI?" The dismissive laughter that followed told me everything I needed to know about my standing in the company. But they had made a critical error. While they were busy cutting my access to Orion Core's internal systems, they had no control over my external relationships with regulatory agencies. Every license I held was registered directly with federal and state authorities, with my personal credentials as the primary contact. The FDA knew me by name. The Department of Commerce had my direct phone number. The EPA had been working with me for over a decade. These weren't corporate assets that could be transferred with a memo. They were professional relationships built over years of meticulous work. I began preparing my contingency plan. Each evening, I reviewed the termination procedures for every license I held. I researched the notification requirements, the appeal processes, the timeline for revocation. I discovered that most of our licenses contained automatic termination clauses if the officer of record was no longer employed by the licensed entity. More importantly, I learned that the revocation process could be initiated immediately upon termination, with no mandatory waiting period. I also began documenting everything, every email, every conversation, every decision that had led to this moment. I printed copies of all relevant contracts and stored them in a safety deposit box. I created encrypted backups of all my professional credentials and stored them on multiple devices. Most importantly, I began compiling a comprehensive list of every active license, every pending application, and every regulatory relationship that would be affected by my departure. The end came on a Tuesday morning in March. I arrived at the office to find a meeting request from HR that had been sent at 6 a.m. Urgent. Please report to conference room B immediately upon arrival. The timestamp told me they had waited until after business hours to send it, ensuring I would have no time to prepare or seek advice. I walked into the conference room to find Adam, our HR director Janet Morrison, and a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be an attorney from the company's legal firm. The setup was theatrical: a box of tissues on the table, a packet of termination documents, and 3 serious faces that tried to project both authority and sympathy. "Clara," Janet began, "we want to thank you for your years of service to Orion Core. However, as part of our organizational restructuring, we've determined that your position is no longer necessary." I listened as she recited the standard corporate termination script: budget constraints, changing business needs. The decision was final and effective immediately. My access cards would be deactivated within the hour. Security would escort me to collect my personal belongings. Adam leaned forward, adopting what he probably thought was a compassionate tone. "We understand this is difficult, but we want to make this transition as smooth as possible. Kelsey has been shadowing your work and will be taking over your responsibilities. We're confident she can handle the regulatory requirements going forward." The attorney slid a settlement agreement across the table. "This includes a generous severance package and extends your healthcare benefits for 6 months. In exchange, we ask that you sign a non-disclosure agreement and a non-compete clause." I read through the documents carefully while they waited. The severance was indeed generous: 6 months of salary plus accumulated vacation time. The non-disclosure agreement was standard, preventing me from discussing proprietary information. But the non-compete clause was more aggressive than usual, preventing me from working in biotechnology or regulatory consulting for 18 months within a 50-mile radius of New York City. When I finished reading, I looked up at their expectant faces. "This is comprehensive," I said. "But there's something you should know about my employment contract." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a folder containing my original agreement. "Section 12B, I said, flipping to the relevant page. "In the event of involuntary termination, I have the right to revoke any licenses held in my name without company consent." The room went quiet. The attorney took the document and read the clause twice. Her expression shifted from professional confidence to concern. "What exactly does this mean?" Adam asked. I smiled for the first time that morning. "It means that every license Orion Corps holds with my name on it, and that's 47 different federal and state authorizations, can be revoked at my discretion. The EPA manufacturing permit, the FDA device certifications, the Department of Commerce export licenses, the DEA controlled substance registrations. All of them." Janet's face had gone pale. "But surely there's a transition period, a way to transfer these licenses?" "Oh, there is," I said. "It typically takes 6 to 18 months to reapply for most of these licenses. Some of them require site inspections that are scheduled months in advance. The export licenses alone would take at least 4 months to reinstate, assuming no complications." The attorney was furiously typing on her laptop, probably researching license transfer procedures. "We weren't aware of this clause," she admitted. "That's because your predecessors didn't think it was important," I replied. "Most companies don't realize that regulatory compliance isn't just about having the right paperwork, it's about having the right people with the right relationships and the right expertise." Adam's confident demeanor had completely evaporated. "What would it take for you to not exercise this right?" I considered the question. These people had spent months planning my termination, systematically cutting my access, and hiring my replacement. They had treated me like an outdated asset to be discarded. Now they wanted to negotiate. "I'm afraid that's not possible," I said, closing my folder. "You see, by terminating my employment, you've already triggered the clause. I'm no longer an Orion Corps employee, which means I'm no longer authorized to hold these licenses on the company's behalf. I have 72 hours to notify the relevant agencies of my status change." I stood up and straightened my jacket. "I assume security is waiting to escort me out?" The next 72 hours were the most carefully orchestrated period of my professional life. I returned to my apartment and opened my safety deposit box, retrieving the USB drive that contained my digital credentials and access codes. I had spent years building relationships with regulatory officials, learning their processes, understanding their requirements. Now it was time to use that knowledge. I began with the most critical licenses first. The EPA manufacturing permit that allowed Orion Corps to produce its primary biotech products required continuous oversight by a certified environmental compliance officer. I was that officer. I logged into the EPA's regulatory portal and initiated the standard notification process for personnel changes, checking the box that indicated my employment status had changed and that I was no longer authorized to represent Orion Corps. The system automatically generated a notice that the permit would be suspended pending appointment of a new authorized representative. Standard procedure required the company to submit documentation within 30 days, proving that a qualified replacement had been appointed. If they failed to meet this deadline, the permit would be revoked entirely. Next, I addressed the FDA device certifications. Orion Corps manufactured several Class II medical devices that required ongoing compliance monitoring. As the registered quality assurance representative, I was personally responsible for ensuring that all manufacturing processes met federal standards. I submitted the required Form FDA 3881, notifying the agency of my departure and requesting immediate suspension of all active certifications. The Department of Commerce export licenses were more complex. Orion Corps regularly shipped biotechnology equipment to research institutions in Europe and Asia. These exports required specific authorizations under the Export Administration regulations, and each license listed me as the empowered official responsible for compliance. I accessed the Bureau of Industry and Security portal and initiated revocation proceedings for all 12 active export authorizations. With each notification, I included a brief professional note explaining that I was no longer employed by Orion Corp and could no longer fulfill my regulatory obligations. I didn't mention the circumstances of my departure or express any animosity toward the company. I simply stated the facts. My employment had ended, and I was following proper procedures to ensure regulatory compliance. By Thursday evening, I had submitted notifications to 14 different federal and state agencies. The bureaucratic machinery was now in motion, and there was no way to stop it. Orion Corp would receive official notices within days, and their licenses would begin expiring one by one. I spent Friday organizing my personal files and preparing for the calls I knew would come. I had no intention of being vindictive or unprofessional, but I also had no obligation to help Orion Corp clean up the mess they had created. They had made their choice, and now they would live with the consequences. The first call came Saturday morning. Adam's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Clara, we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding about your termination. We'd like to discuss bringing you back as a consultant to help with the license transition." I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the morning paper. "I'm not sure what you mean by misunderstanding," I said calmly. My termination seemed quite clear and deliberate. "Look, we may have moved too quickly. We didn't fully understand the implications of your role. What would it take to reverse the license revocations?" "I'm afraid that's not possible," I replied. "Once the revocation process begins, it has to run its course. The agencies don't allow do-overs." I could hear Adam breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "Then what about helping us apply for new licenses? We could bring you back at a significant raise. Full reinstatement. Whatever you want." "That's an interesting offer," I said. "But I'm not sure it addresses the fundamental issue. You terminated me because you believed my role was redundant. If that's your assessment, then surely you don't need my help now." "Clara, please. We're facing a crisis here. Our entire production line could be shut down. The IPO is in jeopardy. We need your expertise." I set down my coffee cup and looked out the window at the quiet Queens Street where I had lived for 15 years. "Adam," I said, "when you hired Kelsey to replace me, you told her she could handle the regulatory requirements. I suggest you give her the opportunity to prove that. She's never applied for federal licenses before. She doesn't know the processes. She doesn't have the relationships. Then perhaps you should have considered that before you decided my experience was outdated." The call ended with Adam making increasingly desperate offers: double my salary, equity stakes, promotion to vice president. I listened politely and declined each one. This wasn't about money or title. This was about respect and the consequences of treating expertise as expendable. By Monday, the situation at Orion Corp had escalated to full crisis mode. I learned this not from any direct contact with the company, but from reading the biotech industry newsletters I subscribed to. Orion Corp's stock price had dropped 12% after rumors began circulating about regulatory complications affecting their IPO timeline. The second call came from Janet Morrison, who adopted a more formal tone than Adam had used. "Clara, I want to apologize for how your termination was handled. We clearly didn't have complete information about your role. We'd like to offer you a consulting contract to help us navigate this situation." "I appreciate the apology," I said, "but I don't think a consulting arrangement would be appropriate. As you noted in my termination meeting, I'm bound by a non-compete agreement that prevents me from working in biotechnology for 18 months. There was a long pause. "We could waive the non-compete clause." "That's generous, but I've already committed to exploring other opportunities. I've actually been contacted by several companies who are interested in my expertise." This was true. Word traveled quickly in the regulatory compliance community, and my sudden availability had generated interest from several Orion Corp competitors. Within a week of my termination, I had received calls from 3 different companies offering positions that would value my experience rather than dismiss it. The most intriguing offer came from Helion Veritas, a clean technology company that had been growing rapidly in the renewable energy sector They were expanding into biotechnology applications and needed someone to build their regulatory compliance program from the ground up. The CEO, Marcus Chen, had called me personally. Clara, I've been following your work for years. The way you managed Orion Corps' regulatory challenges during the 2019 FDA inspection was masterful. We're looking for someone who can help us enter the biotech market with a compliance-first approach. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Marcus understood that regulatory compliance wasn't a cost center, it was a competitive advantage. Companies that got it right could move faster, take bigger risks, and enter new markets with confidence. Companies that treated it as an afterthought found themselves paralyzed by bureaucratic delays and enforcement actions. We want to build something different, Marcus explained. Instead of bolting compliance onto existing processes, we want to design our entire operation around regulatory excellence. We want you to be our chief compliance officer with full authority to establish protocols and hire your own team. The offer was compelling, higher salary than I had ever earned, equity in a growing company, and the opportunity to build a compliance program without the baggage of legacy systems and entrenched attitudes. Most importantly, it was a chance to work with people who valued expertise rather than dismissed it. I accepted the position on Wednesday, exactly 1 week after my termination from Orion Corps. The news broke in the industry press on Thursday. The headline in Biopharma Dive read, "Regulatory expert Clara Whitmore joins Helion Veritas as Chief Compliance Officer." The article noted my 19 years of experience at Orion Corps and quoted Marcus Chen praising my unparalleled expertise in biotechnology regulation. Within hours, I received a frantic call from Orion Corps' CEO, David Richardson, whom I had barely spoken to during my years at the company. "Clara, this is David. I think we need to sit down and discuss this situation. There may have been some miscommunication about your departure." "Hello, David. I don't think there was any miscommunication. Your COO made it very clear that my position was redundant. Adam made a mistake. We're prepared to offer you a significant package to return. Chief Regulatory Officer, full executive compensation, whatever it takes." I almost laughed. For 19 years, I had been the compliance lady who occasionally got invited to management meetings. Now, suddenly, I was executive material. "I appreciate the offer, but I've already accepted a position with Helion Veritas. I start Monday." "Clara, you don't understand. Without your licenses, we can't operate, we can't ship products, we can't run our clinical trials. The whole company is paralyzed." "I understand perfectly. That's why I tried to explain the importance of regulatory compliance during my exit interview. Unfortunately, your team felt confident that my role could be easily replaced." David's voice became strained. "What would it take to get you to reconsider, to at least help us transition these licenses?" I looked around my apartment, where I had been packing for my move to a new place closer to Helion Veritas headquarters. "David, I'm going to be very clear with you. For 19 years, I protected Orion Corps from exactly this situation. I maintained relationships with regulators, stayed current on changing requirements, and ensured that every license was properly managed. When Adam decided to terminate me, he made a calculated decision that this expertise was expendable. I respect that decision, and I expect you to live with it. But surely you realize that hundreds of jobs are at stake. The entire company could collapse. That's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility anymore. I was terminated, remember? My only obligation was to follow proper procedures in notifying the relevant agencies of my departure, which I did. The conversation ended with David making veiled threats about lawsuits and damage to my reputation. I calmly reminded him that I had followed all legal requirements and that any attempt to blame me for Orion Corps' situation would only highlight their own poor judgment in eliminating critical expertise. Over the following weeks, I watched from a distance as Orion Corps spiraled into crisis. The industry publications I read provided regular updates on their deteriorating situation. Their IPO was indefinitely postponed. Major clients began canceling contracts due to shipping delays. The FDA initiated a compliance review after questions arose about their quality assurance procedures. Most telling, Adam Lockridge quietly resigned to pursue other opportunities. His LinkedIn profile mentioned strategic transformation experience, but carefully omitted any reference to his brief tenure at Orion Corp. Kelsey Morton, the young MBA who was supposed to handle my responsibilities, was reportedly overwhelmed by the complexity of the regulatory requirements and had requested transfer to the marketing department. Meanwhile, I was thriving at Helion Veritas. Marcus Chen had given me complete authority to design our compliance program, and I was building something I had always dreamed of, a regulatory framework that was integrated into every aspect of the business rather than bolted on as an afterthought. My first hire was Jennifer Walsh, a talented compliance analyst who had been underutilized at her previous company. Together, we developed protocols that would allow Helion Veritas to move quickly into new markets while maintaining rigorous regulatory standards. We established relationships with key agencies and positioned the company as a model for proactive compliance. The contrast with my Orion Corp experience was striking. At Helion Veritas, compliance was seen as a strategic advantage. When we proposed new procedures or training programs, the response was enthusiastic support rather than budget concerns. When I explained complex regulatory requirements, people listened and asked thoughtful questions rather than dismissing the information as bureaucratic overhead. 3 months after my departure from Orion Corp, I received a final call from David Richardson. His tone was dramatically different from our previous conversation. "Clara, I want to apologize personally for how you were treated. The board has completed its review of the situation, and we've concluded that your termination was a serious error in judgment. I appreciate you saying that, David. We've also decided to restructure our compensation for the regulatory role. We're prepared to offer you a package that would make you one of the highest-paid executives in the company. Full equity participation, board representation, complete autonomy over regulatory decisions." I was sitting in my new office at Helion Veritas, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. On my desk was a draft of our first FDA submission, which would allow us to begin clinical trials for a revolutionary new biomarker technology. The submission was flawless, comprehensive, well-organized, and designed to exceed regulatory requirements rather than merely meet them. "David, that's a very generous offer, but I'm not interested in returning to Orion Corp. May I ask why?" "We're prepared to give you everything you could want." I considered the question. How could I explain that this wasn't about money or title or recognition? How could I make him understand that some mistakes can't be undone with apologies and better offers? "Because," I said finally, "you fired me for being redundant. That tells me everything I need to know about how you value expertise. I'd rather work with people who understand the difference between cost and investment." The call ended politely, but I knew it was the last time I would hear from Orion Corp. 6 months later, I was reading my morning industry briefing when I saw the headline, "Orion Corp Technologies Files for Chapter 11, Bankruptcy Protection." The article detailed how the company had never recovered from the regulatory crisis that began with my departure. Unable to obtain new licenses, they had been forced to halt production of their core products. The IPO had been permanently canceled. Most of their intellectual property had been sold to competitors. Adam Lockridge was quoted in the article, describing the situation as an unfortunate series of regulatory challenges that were beyond our control. He made no mention of the personnel decisions that had precipitated the crisis. I felt no satisfaction in reading about Orion Corp's collapse. Hundreds of people had lost their jobs because of one executive's poor judgment. Promising research projects had been abandoned. Patients who might have benefited from Orion Corp's innovations would have to wait for other companies to develop similar technologies. But I also felt no guilt. I had spent 19 years protecting Orion Corp from exactly this outcome. I had repeatedly warned about the importance of regulatory compliance and the risks of treating it as a peripheral concern. When they decided my expertise was expendable, they made a choice. The consequences of that choice were predictable and preventable. A year after my departure from Orion Corp, Helion Veritas announced its successful completion of Phase 1 clinical trials for 3 different biotechnology applications. Our regulatory submissions had been approved faster than industry averages, and we had established ourselves as a leader in compliance-driven innovation. The company's valuation had tripled, and we were preparing for our own IPO. During the announcement press conference, Marcus Chen was asked about our success in navigating complex regulatory requirements. We believe that regulatory excellence isn't just about following rules, he said. It's about building trust with the agencies and stakeholders who protect public safety. We've been fortunate to have Clara Whitmore leading our compliance efforts. Her expertise and relationships have been invaluable in positioning us for sustainable growth. I was standing at the back of the room, watching the presentation. A reporter noticed me and asked if I had any comments about Helion Veritas's regulatory strategy. Regulatory compliance is often seen as a constraint, I said. But when it's done right, it's actually a competitive advantage. Companies that understand this can move faster and take bigger risks because they have the trust of regulators and the confidence that comes from doing things correctly. After the press conference, I returned to my office and began reviewing applications for our expanding compliance team. We were hiring 5 new analysts to support our growing portfolio of products and partnerships. Each position required specific expertise in different areas of biotechnology regulation. As I read through the resumes, I thought about the lessons I had learned during my career. The most important was that expertise takes years to develop and can be destroyed in minutes. Companies that recognize this and invest accordingly will thrive. Those that don't will eventually face the consequences of their short-sightedness. I also thought about the power of being underestimated. For years at Orion Corp, I had been dismissed as a bureaucratic obstacle rather than recognized as a strategic asset. This perception had worked to my advantage, allowing me to build relationships and accumulate authority without drawing attention to the leverage I was creating. The final lesson was about the importance of preparation. When I sensed that my position at Orion Corp was threatened, I didn't panic or hope for the best. I systematically prepared for the worst-case scenario, documenting my authority and understanding my options. When the termination came, I was ready to respond effectively. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Jennifer Walsh, calling from the FDA offices in Maryland where she was attending a regulatory conference. "Clara, you're not going to believe this," she said. "I just ran into Kelsey Morton from Orion Corp. She's working as a marketing coordinator at a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey now. She wanted me to tell you that she finally understands why regulatory compliance is so complex." I smiled. "Did she say anything else?" "She said she wishes she had paid more attention during those few weeks when she was supposed to be learning your job. She realized that there's a huge difference between reading about regulations and actually implementing them." After ending the call, I returned to the resume reviews. One application particularly caught my attention. A young analyst with a PhD in biochemistry and 2 years of experience at a consulting firm. Her cover letter demonstrated a genuine understanding of the strategic importance of regulatory compliance, not just the technical requirements. I made a note to schedule an interview. Building a strong compliance team required finding people who shared my philosophy about the role of regulation in innovation. It wasn't enough to hire people who could follow procedures. I needed people who understood that regulatory excellence was a competitive advantage. As the afternoon wore on, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 18 months ago, I had been a dismissed employee, escorted out of an office building with a box of personal belongings. Today, I was a C-level executive at a rapidly growing company, building the compliance program I had always envisioned. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. But it had taught me that expertise is portable. Relationships matter more than titles. And sometimes the best response to being undervalued is to find people who understand your worth. I locked my office and headed home to my new apartment in Manhattan, a significant upgrade from my old place in Queens. The view from my living room window included the building where Orion Corp used to have its headquarters. The space was now occupied by a different company, and I often wondered what had happened to the conference room where I had been terminated. But I didn't dwell on the past. I was too busy building the future, a future where regulatory compliance was recognized as the foundation of sustainable innovation, where expertise was valued over efficiency, and where the people who understood the rules were the ones who got to write them. That evening, I opened a bottle of wine and toasted the lessons I had learned and the opportunities that lay ahead. Tomorrow, I would continue building something that had never existed at Orion Core, a company that understood the difference between cost and investment, between bureaucracy and excellence, between following rules and mastering them. The license keeper had found her kingdom, and this time she would make sure it was built to last.